All right, in this video, we're going to walk through three very small and short letters written by the same person, kind of put them together. Take some time, a little bit on the first one especially, and then John 2 and 3 we'll kind of go through quickly. But they each have slightly their own thing to say, but a lot of the big ideas come together for all of them. So we'll just put them together in this one video. And you can quickly read all three of those letters at one sitting anyway. So I think this should make sense. Let's start with authorship. We have a pretty strong sense that all three of these letters were written by John, called the Elder, who is likely also the person who wrote the Gospel of John, or at least his church community. So First John and the Gospel of John are very similar, as we'll see. So church history is often equated with the Apostle John, as we discussed when covering the Gospel, claiming to be an eyewitness. It seems like this is the same John talking. So it was probably written in the late 80s, the early 90s. As you'll see in the next video, moving forward, talking about Revelation, there's questions, ideas that this is probably the same John as well. And so this could have been slightly before that or in this similar time. And we also know that this was written to a particular church community. The author was clearly close to these people and knew them well. As we'll see in 2nd John and 3rd John, they're very personal letters written to very specific people. We just finished talking about Peter's letters, 1st and 2nd Peter. These were very open-ended letters, kind of directed to the whole church community. Pass these around, read these. These three letters by John are very personal correspondence. It's great that they've been kept, and because John was an apostle and a witness, the early church definitely believed that anything he wrote should be kept, but they have a very personal feel to them. And so John doesn't defend himself, doesn't really introduce himself a lot. He doesn't need to include a lot of persuasive talk to convince his audience to listen to him. It sounds like he's writing to people who know him and trust him, but he has some important things to say to them. So let's talk about the purpose of writing, starting in 1st John. What is John doing in 1st John? Well, behind the scenes, what we see is people had been arguing about theology. Go figure. Yes, we've been doing it for 2,000 years. And this is the really crazy thing. You are not going to believe this. Apparently, in the 1st century, people were leaving churches because they disagreed over theology. Now, I know, that's probably blowing your mind. Like, what? People do that? Yes, 2,000 years later, we still do it. So questions over what was true, what was real doctrine, were dividing people, and they were breaking up. And defectors, people that were leaving the church, had called into question some of the core beliefs. They were leaving over what actually are today are really big issues. So they were big issues back then for John. They weren't like small, tiny things that John's talking about here. So just keep that in mind, first and foremost. Yes, people leave churches sometimes over silly reasons. In the first letter to John, and then he'll talk about in the 2nd, 3rd, John is actually talking about some pretty big theological ideas. So it's not like the music was too loud, so we left, and John's like, you heretics. No, that's not. They're talking about core, huge issues of theology here. And specifically, the big issue he wants to talk about that apparently people are divided over and fighting over, and would continue to be divided over and fight over for a number of centuries, was the incarnation, the extent to which God became a human. And some people disagreed over this issue, were apparently leaving and moving on and causing trouble. So there were two sides. In the middle, we say Jesus is fully God and fully man. One error over the side is, no, Jesus was actually just a normal guy. He was just a normal human person who became the Christ at his baptism, received the Spirit, and he's just a normal human being, which is a big problem for John. Others argue that, well, actually, Jesus was never really a human being. He just kind of looked like it. It was kind of like a mystical thing that you just looked at him, you thought he was human, but he wasn't really human. So for John, both of these people are wrong. Both of these are ideas that are wrong and need to be corrected. And people that are teaching them or leaving the church over them need to be addressed and talked about. So for John, he needs to go back to the beginning. That this is false, this is heresy, it should be rejected. And the big idea for John in this letter, and really all three of his letters, and a lot of his gospel as well, the light of the incarnation. And John loves to use light and dark imagery. Light, sunlight shining, being the truth, and darkness hiding in shadows, being things that aren't true. The incarnation is light, it's truth, it's shining light on things so you can see it clearly. The light of the incarnation, true believers who are in the light, in the truth, accept the incarnation, that Jesus was fully a human. He took on full humanity, but was also at the same time fully God from the beginning, fully God, fully man. And this leads to an expectation that we are to love one another and avoid sin and live holy lives as his followers. And the connection here is that God becoming a man, God becoming human and dying proves his great love for us. He took on our full humanity, and because he was fully human, his sacrifice, his blood covers our sin and defeats the power of sin in our lives. So here's John's argument. You will know if someone is truly committed to Christ and in the truth, in the light, that they're really a child of God, as opposed to those who've turned away and caused problems. They are living in the light, in the truth, if they acknowledge and accept the full incarnation. God became a human being. And this will be expressed through their love for one another, their holy lives. That will be an outflow of this belief. Jesus is fully God, fully man. So let's just quickly walk through how he does that in 1 John. From the beginning, John would say from the beginning. Remember, he starts his gospel. In the beginning was the Word. John opens by reminding the church that what he is teaching and what the church believes concerning Christ, this was the truth from the beginning. He was there. He was there. He's like, listen, guys, I was there. I walked with Jesus. I laid my head in his lap. He was fully human. I experienced it firsthand. And I know that was 50 or 60 years ago. I'm an old man now, but I can tell you I was there, and there are others still alive who were there. He was fully human. He was a man. When he resurrected, we touched the holes in his hand. He was a human being. We knew him. So anybody telling you otherwise, they're false teachers. Don't listen to them. They're lying. Listen to me. I was there. The truth is light, and Christians must live in this light if they want to know God. You have to be able to see what's around you to know the truth, and the truth starts with Jesus was God become a man. And we can't say we're followers of him if we're living in the dark. And for John, that means denying this truth. If you deny that Jesus wasn't really fully God in human flesh, you're in the dark. You're living a lie. You're not the truth, and that's a problem. So moving into chapter 2, live in the light. If you're in the light, if you're part of this, live in it. And so for him, that's touching back on a few different issues that all relate to what it means for a Christian to be in the light, to accept Jesus' full humanity as God in flesh. And it's this. Here's the simple, most truest, basic statement. If you are in Christ, if you're part of this, live like him. Live like him. Whoever claims to live in him must live as he did, must walk in his steps. To live in him is to love the way Christ loved. And now notice the connection here. Because God was fully man, because Jesus took on humanity and was fully human, we can then experience the life we're created for by living like Jesus. Living like Jesus is regaining the image of God because Jesus was fully human, and everything Jesus did we can do because he was fully human. So we accept the truth that he was fully human, and then we follow his example and pattern our lives off of his life. And how did he live his life? He loved other people. Rather than loving the world and all that kind of stuff, he called us to love each other. And this would be the way that would be known. Our love for each other and our reliance on him will show that we are truly children of God. This is how we know Christ, that he laid down his life for us. And notice, and this is kind of behind the scenes, he's kind of juxtapositioning, he's comparing those people who've left the church. I know I'm a pastor. It's like, people that leave my church, they're heretics. It's not, again, people that maybe leave a church because the music's too loud or they don't have good relationships or, whatever, they're bored. That's not quite what he's saying here. He's referring to people who are literally denying the incarnation, and therefore left the church and created problems. He says they're not living in the truth. They're actually opposed to Christ. And he uses this really huge, powerful Greek word, anti, against or opposed to Christos. This is where the word antichrist comes from. Notice he's not talking about some end times thing. He's talking about a person who denies the incarnation. A person who denies that Jesus was fully God and fully human is anti-Christos, and living in the dark. They're not in the truth, and they're causing problems. Now, in chapter 4, he wants to get a bit theological and talk about, okay, let's talk about why this matters, guys. Let me just explain to you. Here's why it's so important. And chapter 4 of 1 John is a hugely important part of our scriptures, and it ties into the Gospel of John a lot. the point of emphasis that this all comes down to for John and the incarnation is God became a man. So Jesus is both a man and he's God. Anyone that denies this full incarnation is contrary to Jesus. They're antichristos because, and this isn't a small point, this is everything for John. If you deny the incarnation, you're denying, number one, you're denying a couple things. Number one, the incarnation is where God demonstrates his great love for us and shows us who he is. If Jesus wasn't fully God, then his death, his sacrifice, and his life doesn't actually tell us that much about God. He was just a good dude. The fact that Jesus is fully God means when I look at him, when I see his life, when I hear his teachings, I'm not just hearing another person. I'm hearing God speak to me. I'm hearing God live out God's intentions for how we should be living. And by him coming himself and dying, it's not like God sent some other random dude, hey, you, go die for them. No, he came and died for us himself. The greatest act of love is God choosing to do this. God chose the nails himself. So if you deny the incarnation, if Jesus wasn't fully God, then it wasn't God who bore those nails for you. It wasn't God who showed you how to live and taught you the truth. It wasn't God that said, this is what I want for your life. He just had someone else do it. And that's a lie. That's the dark. What's more, being fully human, taking on our flesh, taking on the earth, taking on dirt and clay and dust. He became one of us. He shows us what's possible as a human. And he fully atones for our sin. By becoming one of us and suffering for us, he bridges the gap between us and God. If Jesus wasn't fully God, his death hasn't actually saved us from sin. And if he wasn't fully human, then it wasn't really humanity suffering and dying for humanity, right? So for John, they're both happening here. And it's big stuff, but it's so important. He's both God and both man. So the big idea is the light, the truth of the incarnation. And to deny this truth is to not be living in truth, is to be living in the dark. And if you're in the dark, you're not a true child of God. So this is heavy stuff. John is basically saying, if you deny the incarnation, you're not even a child of God. Like, forget about which church you go to. Like, you're not even a child of God. If somebody denies the incarnation and says, Jesus wasn't fully God and fully man, they aren't just like disagreeing over a small point. They're outside the fold. They're not even part of our family. And so, Christian churches today would say that's a core doctrine. That's a core tenet of our faith. We can disagree over the superfluous things on the outside, but if you disagree over the incarnation, you're not part of this Christian community, according to John. And so, that's the big idea of 1 John. Now, knowing he was talking about people leaving churches, things like that, here's the big idea. 2nd and 3rd John take on a much more personal tone, but with all of that behind the scenes. John writes 2 more letters, and behind them is the incarnation and the truth of who Jesus is, who's for it, who's against it. But 2nd John and 3rd John have a slightly different purpose, and we actually know the purpose for both of them. Likely written around the same time as the first letter, same era. These are 2 very short, concise, direct messages that were actually addressed to specific people. Now, Paul wrote some letters that were addressed to specific churches, to the church in, Ephesus or whatever. These letters are like, I'm writing this person a letter. So these weren't written to a church necessarily. John was writing to a friend, to a person that he knew, and for a very specific reason. Now, what's cool is they have so much behind them that we can still pull from and learn from. But just knowing that John's sitting down, writing a letter to a friend. This isn't like Paul writing Romans, some big theological treatise. This is John writing to friends. And let me walk through these then. You'll understand there's some context to them. 2nd John is addressed to the lady chosen by God and her children, who was most likely a female who ran a house church. And I know that messes with some of us, but she would have been, it was very common for widows to be overseers of households. Small side note, women married very young, and often they married older men who were on their 2nd or 3rd marriage. So if you're 15 and you marry a 45-year-old and he dies at 60, you're the head of the household at 30, right? So this was very common. And oftentimes we see in church history that a lot of these women opened up their homes and had churches in their homes and committed their lives to Christ and their ministry. So that was apparently what was happening here. He's writing to her Second John. In Third John, he gives a very specific name, a man named Gaius, who was also probably a church leader and one of John's friends in a different city. So he's writing to both Second and Third John appear to be written to leaders of churches in different places. They're both very small, normal-sized letters that would fit on a piece of papyrus, like, one piece of paper, folded up, here you go. Short messages that communicate an important idea. And he actually ends each of these two letters by saying he wants to speak to him face to face, but he has something important to say right now. So what's going on with these letters? Here's what's happening. Okay. As we saw in the first letter, some members of John's church had defected and left their church, okay, over disagreements about who's using. Okay. Where are they going? If you leave a church, where are you going? And I just want you to think about this for a moment. And everyone watching this video, you're in different places, different contexts. But let's say you live in a normal city in America. I am recording this in East County, San Diego, California. If you leave the church that I'm a part of in San Diego area, there's like 150 other churches you can go to. There's literally a church about a half a mile down the road that you can go to. Where does somebody go when they leave a church in the first century? It's not like every town had 50 churches. Plus, if you were leaving because of a major theological issue, do you go, if there is another house church maybe a mile away, do they have a different theological issue? Where do they go? Now watch this. If what you do is, you leave the town and you go to the town next to you and you go to a church there, this might be normal. Well, we're not going to go to church here. Well, my only other option is, to walk down that road 4 miles to another small village and go to that church. This was common. This would actually happen. But it created a problem. And the problem was, if somebody's walking to your church from another town and you're the church leader, you might be like, wait, why are you coming to our church? Why did you leave your church? Right? What's going on? Why are you coming here? And imagine this. Imagine that you're the overseer, you're the leader of the church, and a husband and wife come to you and say, hey, we'd like to attend your community gathering at your home. Like, oh, where are you from? Oh, we're from the town next to you guys. Oh, well, there's a church there. Actually, the elder John runs that church. Why are you leaving? Why don't you go to his church? Oh, we'd rather go to your church. Why? What's going on? What's happening here? So that was one issue. And here's another issue. We see this in the New Testament as well. While you had overseers of churches at all the different locations, you also had people that were called evangelists. You had people that were called prophets. You had teachers and apostles. These appear to be titles of people who took it upon themselves or felt called by God to offer a different kind of ministry or service to the local church. And while it's possible that one small house church might have someone in there who considered themselves a prophet, a person who really was like called to be a prophet in the New Testament church probably traveled from town to town. We actually see this in the Shepherd of Hermes, a non-canonical book written shortly after this, that prophets would travel and teachers would travel. They would go from town to town and instruct and then move on to the next town. So how do you know if somebody comes to you and says, hey, I'm a prophet, can I share at your home church this weekend? How do I know? Same issue. So whether it's a person saying, I want to come to your church because I'm leaving this church, or a person saying, I'm a teacher or something, how do you know what to do with these people? Well, if you needed to know whether to accept a new member in or to allow a traveling missionary or someone to speak or offer them hospitality, or are these troublemakers who deny the incarnation or false prophets that I need to be kicking out of town, not welcoming to church? How do I know? Well, 2 John and 3 John tell us how they did this. It tells us that the various church leaders would actually communicate with each other. They would send small letters to one another. Just here, so while we've kept 1 and 2 John, because John was the Apostle John, all of the overseers were probably writing these letters to each other all the time, and we just didn't keep them because we didn't believe they were written by an apostle. So letters would be sent. Letters would be sent as letters of recommendation. So if John actually believed that somebody like Demetrius in John 3 was in fact a prophet inspired by God, he would write a letter and he'd say, hello, so-and-so, please welcome Demetrius into your local church community and listen to him. I, John, the elder, vouch for him. And he would give the letter to Demetrius, who would then travel other cities and say, hey, I'd like to speak. Look, I've got a letter from John the elder saying you can trust me. Oh, great, come on in. So they'd work that way. Secondly, if somebody was creating problems in my church and said, I'm leaving this, I'm going to go to the church downtown, the other town next to us, I might say, okay, well, you do you. I can't control you. You know, you're free. But I actually know the pastor of that church, and I'm going to write him a little letter. Hey, just so you know, we had a couple here that they're like denying Jesus was fully God, a lot of problems. I told them they had to leave. They said they're going to go to your church. I just want you to know to expect trouble. And oftentimes, at least in this letter, he gets pretty harsh with them. Liars, deceivers, watch out for them. Don't let them in. Be wary of those people. So a letter could be recommendation or warning. Hey, there's this guy traveling around telling people he's a prophet. He's no prophet. Don't listen to him. Ignore him. Or, hey, these people left our church because their son is sick and he's in their community, so they actually want to go to your church. Here's a letter. Just, they're great people. Let them in. Welcome them. They're awesome. They're not leaving on bad terms. Oh, great, right? So that's how they would communicate, through letters. So 2 John, John addresses a letter to a specific church and begins by recognizing that they're doing well, they're walking in the faith, just as his church is. Continue going, but be on guard. So he gives a very short but direct and clear warning that some people might be headed your way who don't accept the incarnation. They're actually deceivers. They're wicked. Don't let them in. If you have some people showing, hey, we want to come to your church, we left John's, I'm telling you, don't let them in. Be wary of them. Be on guard. Anyone who comes to you saying they left their church because they don't believe in the resurrection, don't let them into your community. You don't want that trouble. That's 2 John. 3 John, he commends this guy Gaius, who was the overseer of the church. He was grateful for his hospitality. He's helped people. It's just kind of a good welcoming. But then 9 through 14, it's a letter of recommendation. So 3 John is actually a letter that John would have given a man named Demetrius. And so in response, there was, so you can read the letter yourself, but basically there was a church leader named Diotrephes, who apparently rejected another person named Demetrius, but did it in John's mind for selfish reasons. He didn't think it was right. So John is actually writing a letter to another church leader, Gaius, telling him that, no, Demetrius walks in truth. He should be accepted. Don't listen to that. I vouch for this guy. Welcome him in. So what's kind of cool about these letters is when you understand the backstory, you realize they're actually really real, personable, real situations that kind of still happen today. This might weird you out, but pastors today still talk. There are people who leave their churches and, they're like, we're out of here. And their pastor lets us know, hey, just let you know that we heard they're headed your way. Like, oh, okay. Or, like speakers who want to speak at your church, we're like, hey, they spoke at your church. How'd it go? We still do that today, but it was a big deal back then. So 2 and 3 John, the big ideas are warnings and recommendations. Look out for this. This is problem. Hey, this guy's good. This guy's not good. But all of it for John centers around the incarnation. If these people, I'll give you some leeway. We don't have to agree on everything. We can disagree on things. But if you're rejecting the incarnation, don't let them in your church. Don't let them preach. Don't let them prophesy. Keep them out. Those people that's undermining the whole thing. All right. So those are the letters from the elder John. Great letters, short, but really cool what they have to say. So I encourage you to read them and study them and know them well. And to walk as Jesus did is what it means to be in Christ. So, all right. Well, we're going to do a short walk through the book of Jude. I'm going to make that a separate video because it's actually got some dense stuff, even though it's really short. And then we'll end up with our Revelation, and that'll be our study of the New Testament. So hope this video was helpful. See you in the next one. Thanks, guys.